Hello, this is Eliza Inkberry with Horticulture 101 Gothic Gardening at Darkside University. I'm doing a student request composting video, and so I'm starting with topsoil loss, and this is an article that was actually written in 1980, which is very full of foresight that we are having a massive problem with losing topsoil. We've been having it for a while, but people are just starting to pay attention to it in mass. But um, in my area, we have maybe at most an inch of topsoil in most places, and the rest of it's subsoil, and it's very hard to plant in subsoil. And topsoil is basically the process of composting, but done at nature's pace. And so when you're composting, you're speeding up the soil building process by piling all that organic matter in one place instead of it being dropped down bit by bit from trees and plants that are dying back. So keep that in mind that that's what you're doing, and that kind of makes it make a little more sense. Um, this is the soil food web. I like this particular drawing of it because it's very linear. You can see the trees drop the organic matter, or just the plants here die back, and this starts to get broken down by fungi and bacteria, and then the larger organisms continue the process, or they consume the fungi and the bacteria and so on. And so this is going on inside your compost pile. So imagine this is the materials you've collected for your compost pile. And then the same thing's going on in the forest. You have something like a log breaking down, and a log's going to take a lot of time to break down, which is good if you're doing something like hugelkultur, which you can look up at richsoil.com and a lot of other places at this point. But if you're doing composting, you don't want to put something as large as a log in there because it's going to take too much time to break down. You want something with more surface area. So even wood chip mulch I wouldn't put in compost, but things like leaves and straw and smaller pieces that have lots of surface area for the fungi and the bacteria to immediately get to it and start breaking it down is the perfect thing to use in compost. I have a list here of compost ingredients. It's pretty simple. And this is page 2. So let's go to page 1. But basically, anything that is from a plant, an animal, or a fungus is going to break down into compost. So you may hear, oh, you can't use this or you can use that. And it really has more to do with things like particle size or how well it mixes with other stuff, and possibly even whether or not it's going to attract rats or something to your compost pile. And those things can still be composted, but you either need a fine mesh wire cage to do it in, or you need to just bury it in the ground like you're burying a pet. Deep enough that it's not going to get dug up by other animals. And those things will break down as well. So you need to look at the 4 questions here. Is it biodegradable? So, plastic's off the list. Will it help to make high quality nutrient rich compost? You don't need to worry about that as much. If it's going to break down, it's going to break down. You don't want to say use a giant pile of paper as your compost, because you're not going to get a whole lot of nutritive value out of that. But you can have some paper in your compost, so it's okay if you've got some ingredients that are not contributing as much nutrient wise. Did it come from a chemical free lawn? The reason that's important is if someone's using a lot of herbicides to keep their lawn weed free, it doesn't all break down in the composting process, then when you spread that on your plants, the herbicide still has the potential to kill your plants. In a lot of cases, if there's only a very small amount of that, then the mushrooms and the other life in your compost is going to take care of those toxins, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And the same thing here, is it free of diseases, toxins, and other contaminants? If you've got a healthy soil food web, a small amount of these things will get taken care of, especially the disease. For the most part, most diseases can get broken down in compost, and especially if it's a hot compost pile. But if I'm concerned about it, I just bury the diseased plant material pretty far away from the garden, and that way it's going to break down somewhere and not go to the landfill and not be burned and added to air pollution. But it's also not going to be added on my garden anytime soon. Um, so the good stuff, I think these qualifiers are not necessary, but greens count as anything that's nitrogen based. We refer to the nitrogen ingredients as greens, even though they often are not green. Like, for example, chicken manure is not going to be green, but it gets referred to as a green in compost jargon. Um, and all of these would be fine. And there's tons of list of greens and browns or carbons and nitrogens on the internet. And if you want a more expansive list of possible things, you can look for that. But it's really going to be your greens are often your wetter material. They're higher in nutrients. Proteins are usually, or they're always nitrogens, and greens. And then browns are going to be your heavily carbon based stuff, so stalks and leaves and dried up stuff. Um, so I want to go back to their second page. So there's the carbons, which are the browns, but the second page has a list of things not to use, and I did want to talk about that a little bit. Um, so again, I'm talking about, I think the diseased plants don't necessarily need to be thrown in the garbage or burned. You can bury them somewhere, and your soil organisms will eat those diseased elements. And then I think we're a little too manure phobic in the US. I don't think it's a great idea that we throw this stuff away or we just leave it in our yard and it gets washed off into the watershed, into the rivers and stuff. So we end up with coliforms and signs saying we're not allowed to go swimming and so on. If you put a bin somewhere far from your house and you have a giant pile of carbon, maybe sawdust, wet sawdust is a great option, and you put manures there, any kind, you can then pile the carbon on top of it and it's not going to smell and it's going to break down. And if you are really concerned, you could leave it there for a year. If a lot of other countries only wait about 3 months, 6 months. It's going to break down. It's not going to be toxic at that point. Anything that was in it that could infect us is going to be dead. So for a year, you're definitely not going to have anything left after that. I collect materials from the side of the road all the time. Especially if people have put it out on the curb. So I don't know that I agree with this materials from the side of the road, including grass clippings. If you look at someone's lawn and it's a perfect carpet of green, then yeah, you probably don't want their stuff. I always look for lawns that are kind of weedy, and I take their clippings because they're obviously not spraying anything. Or sometimes I even ask people, because most people are happy for you to take their things that they're throwing out. And then meat, dairy products, bones, and fish. They actually don't decompose. Well, bones decompose slowly, but most of high protein stuff decomposes very, very quickly. And the other thing is protein is nitrogen, so it's a very high nutritive organic matter. And again, if you're burying that, if you want to bury it under your rose bush or your apple tree or whatever, then you're not going to smell it. It's going to break down. And if you think about it, you've probably heard stories about Native Americans burying a fish in each mound of the plants that they were growing in their agricultural systems. And that's why. It's because it's high in nitrogen. So I don't throw those things out, I just bury them. And I do agree with the paper. You don't want a ton of that. A lot of these inks are soy based now. Not most, but a lot of things, like most people's newspapers and stuff, are no longer printed with toxic ink. But the compost you get out of a pile of paper just isn't that high quality. Um, so if you want to get really scientific about the ratio of ingredients to use to get the fastest, the most efficient, the best compost, then you want to read something like this Cornell Composting website. And the thing that you want to pay attention to is this 30 to 1 right here. And that's 30 parts brown or carbon to 1 part green or nitrogen. And so we'll look at that in more detail right here. This is just a little drawing representing this being 30 parts carbon or browns and this little green stripe being the 1 part greens or nitrogen. And so fresh green fresh green grass clippings are considered a green, but then once you dry them and they become more like straw, they're considered a carbon. So if you've let them sit out and dry till they turn brown, they're a carbon, and if they're still green, they're a, a green or a nitrogen. So let's say you've got some leaves right here as your 30-part carbon, and then you're going to add a strip of, say, grass clippings right here, and then you might add another 30-part straw, and then you might add a 1 part of kitchen scraps right here, and then you might add some more leaves, and then you might add some manure right here as your green, and so on. And I like this drawing in particular because it's got a little bit of a dip in the top, and that means when it rains it's not just going to run off the sides like it would if this was a peak. If they had filled the pile so high that it had a peak at the top here, then the rain's just going to run right off. But instead it's going to pool right here and then soak into the pile. And the other thing is this pile could be done as a hot compost, or it could be done as a cold compost. And if you're going to do a hot compost, you're going to turn it. So we'll look at another version of that, and this one has twigs in the bottom, and that's a good option. That or kind of some stalky material, like if you have a bunch of corn stalks or anything that's kind of dry and carbony but still very brittle and easy to break and hollow. That's a really good material to put on the bottom of your compost because it keeps it more aerated. And by twigs, it does not mean big stems of things. So the nitrogen and carbon, this is showing it as kind of even, but you do want to do your 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. It doesn't matter if it's exact at all. It's going to rot no matter what you do. The thing is, if you have more nitrogen, if the nitrogens are off balance to the carbon, then it's going to smell. And it's going to be an anaerobic compost because it'll be too wet for the organisms to live. And speaking of wet, you do want to water each one of these layers as you put them in. So you put in the first layer and you water it. You put in the second layer and you water it. You put in the third layer and you water it. And that's because you need a fine film of water clinging to all those particles for the soil food web to do well. But you're also going to have oxygen in that pile. If you had, too much nitrogen, like if this was a big pile of kitchen scraps, like really watery vegetables and stuff, then, and this was too, for instance, then this is going to start to get soggy, not like wrung out sponge wet, but more like a bog wet. And then you're going to have that kind of rotten egg smell, and it's going to be kind of goopy and anaerobic, and that's most of us don't want that in our backyard. We don't want our neighbors to notice. If that does happen to you, it's an easy fix. You just add more carbon. So, if you don't have any left, go buy a bale of straw. If not, if you have something, like collect some leaves, put something in it that's gonna add some more carbon. So this is 18-day compost, and this is if you want really fast compost. And this is actually kind of the premise behind those tumblers as well, because if you add the right ratio of 1 part nitrogen to 30 parts carbon in those tumbler composters, and then you're turning it every second day, you should get this same result. But what they're doing here is day 1, they made the pile like this. They made this pile. And then they leave it alone until day 4. They watered each layer as they put it in. They left it alone. And then day 4, you turn it. Okay, so you turn it and you add more water if you need to, which often you do at this stage. And then day 6, it should already be getting hot, which is this little guy illustration saying ow, but it gets really hot inside, like burn your hand hot. And if you stick your hand into the center of the pile, it's going to be very warm. And I did want to mention also that the ideal size of a pile is going to be 3 to 4 feet across and 3 to 4 feet tall. And that's to provide an insulating capacity for the center part so it gets nice and hot and kills weed seeds. But it's also so that the pile's not so big that you end up with those anaerobic conditions. So in day 6, you're going to be getting a hotter pile and you're going to turn it again. And if you notice, the first day you leave it for 4 days, and then after that you turn it every other day until you reach day 18. And depending on how balanced your ingredients were, it'll be finished. If it's not finished yet, just keep turning it every other day until it is. And finished compost, you can no longer tell what the ingredients were. There should be no recognizable pieces of organic matter in there. If you have something like a corn cob or an avocado peel, that may not have gotten decomposed like the rest of it, and that's okay because those just decompose slowly. They will eventually, but they take longer. But for the most part, if everything is unrecognizable, then you're good to go and use it. These are cold compost piles, and I show this because I don't want composting to seem hard. These are just piles that just sit there until they get around to rotting. And that might even be a worm bin here. Worm bins are great. I use mine as a junk mail shredder. I shred up all of my junk mail and use that as the bedding, and then we put kitchen scraps in there. And I'll admit that usually the kitchen scraps go in there in the cold weather when nobody wants to go outside, or when it's raining and nobody wants to go outside. They're pretty easy to maintain, and it makes it so I never have to throw things with our address and name and whatever in the trash. Um, Anyway, this is just a pile, and you can see it's quite a lot bigger than the 4 feet high and wide, and it's rotting just fine. It just takes longer. Sometimes it takes as much as a year, and if there's no water in it, it might not rot at all. So when you do put these piles, these cold piles in, make sure you're watering them. The other thing you can get, I actually didn't include it, but a compost turner is a pretty good tool. I mean, a pitchfork is a good tool. You see someone using that. Handheld. And oh, there they are. A compost bin turner right here. Okay, so these things right here are tools that you just kind of jab down into the compost. You see these little things sticking out right here on the side. Those are hinged, and they will fold up like an arrow when you punch it down into the compost, and then once you start pulling on it, they flip open and it ruffles the compost as you pull it back out of the bin or the pile. And that's just easier than having to turn the whole thing. And the whole point of that is getting some oxygen down in there. If you're feeling particularly lazy and you want to make sure there's enough water, you can just turn your hose on full blast and hold it over that hole and shoot the water down in there. And so that's one way to get your compost to go a little bit faster without doing the Berkeley method where you're turning it every other day for 18 days. I included this because it's a nice thing if you're trying to fertilize with your compost. So if you looked up this PDF, it is an analysis of the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in organic matter, so you can kind of formulate an ideal fertilizer for whatever kind of plant you're using. So if you know, for instance, that the plant you're using needs like a 3-2-2 in NPK, which is what you'll find on the labels of fertilizer, then you can look for ingredients that are going to mimic that and build your compost that way. And then I included this video that I recommend you look up and watch. It's Toxins in Compost, and you can see the address up here. And it's a good little video on the fact that a lot of your minor toxins and stuff are going to break down. The soil food web is going to take care of those, so you don't have to be that paranoid about it. Unless you're putting something that's really coated in chemicals in there, you should be fine. And if you've got something that's really coated in chemicals, say you have an oil spill, which I hope not, or you have, but sometimes you're doing some car maintenance and you spill things even in your own driveway, and even though it's a tiny oil spill, it's still an oil spill. Or maybe you have railroad ties that someone decided to use for a garden bed edging and didn't know that it was leaking toxins into the ground because it's been treated so it won't rot. You can actually do micro-remediation to eat that and break it down into non-toxic compost. So it's a way of composting. And I know that Mushroom Mountain is a good place to get it from. And if you're on the West Coast, there are tons of people selling micro-remediation mushrooms for your region. If you're on the East Coast, I highly recommend Mushroom Mountain. They do an amazing job. I feel like Trad Cotter is the premier mycologist on the East Coast. So they'll sell you mushrooms that break down, tell them what you're trying to remediate, and they will recommend to you the best mushroom for that and tell you how to inoculate it and get it to start growing on it. And then it's going to break that down for you. Um, these are different kinds of bins. You can look up all kinds of plans online. My bin is a 3 bin system like this. I have actually several different types of bins. I make a lot of compost because I'm an urban farm. I need a lot of compost and I need a lot of space to store organic matter if I'm not going to just compost in place, which I do a thing called chop and drop, which is the easiest composting ever because you just chop the plant down right where it is and leave it there and it's going to rot right there. But and sometimes I'll even, if my paths are full of wood chips and I don't feel like walking all the way to the compost pile, or I've got something with meat in it in my compost, I dig a hole in my wood chip mulch and I bury the kitchen waste right there and I leave it in the path to break down. And that's a totally viable way of composting as well. But you can get these kind of tumblers. I really only recommend those if you're producing a small amount of compost for, say, no bigger than like a 10 by 4 garden bed. Um, and if you're going to have more than that in gardening, you're going to want to come up with a bigger composting plan. If you don't want to have to buy all your compost. So, or you don't even have to come up with bigger bins. You can just use that path system if you've got a bigger amount of beds. So these are just different plans, and I like this one because our chickens go in these and they kick around the compost and they eat stuff. And if I don't want them to, then I can put boards in the way so they can't get in there. Or if they do actually, they hop in, but they can't kick it all out of the bin, which is a good thing. Um, and speaking of chickens, we also do another kind of composting. When we have more nitrogen or green material than we can take care of, we use our soldier fly composter, which is sort of like a worm bin. And every time you hear someone talk about these, they usually say black soldier fly larva. And that's because everybody is turned off by the word maggot, but it is maggot composting. And you can see those here. And this is the fly. It doesn't have mouth parts at this stage, and it also emits a pheromone that drives away house flies. So it's kind of a helpful fly. It's a native fly, at least on the southeast coast of the U.S. I don't know about elsewhere. And it's attracted to the smell of rotting kitchen scraps or manures or meat, and it will show up and rapidly decompose it. If you look up black soldier fly larva on YouTube, you can see some interesting time-lapse photography of how quickly it does that. And then this one's a self-harvesting one. This gutter in the middle, this is the model that I have. Mine has a blue bin, but it looks just like this, except it doesn't have the casters because I've got it in the chicken run and it would sink. But the black soldier fly larvae march up this thing and then they fall into a trough that you can't see because these chickens are so busy eating, and they just eat it all up, and you get nicer eggs with very high nutrient quality, and you're recycling. You're not sending all that food to the landfill. And then finally, I wanted to talk about, if you want to know even more about the science of composting, this article is excellent on composting for the homeowner by the Illinois Extension. And they've got some other links on the side here that are great, but it's basically the same. It's like a summary of a book that I strongly recommend called Teeming with Microbes by Jeff Lowenfels and Wayne Lewis. But it's a nice little summary of that, and it'll give you all the science that, or a really good summary of the science of how composting works, which will make it so that you have a better idea of what's going on, and if you have a particular goal, you'll be better at doing that. But again, composting is not as complicated as we make it out to be, and oh no, looks like it's gonna fail on me again. It's not that complicated, and you can do it by just putting a pile up. Let's see.